Welcome to AUSA's Army Matters podcast. This is Thought Leaders with Joe Craig. My guest today is Kevin J. Weddle, author of The Compleat Victory, Saratoga, and the American Revolution. Kevin J. Weddle is professor of military theory and strategy at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. A West Point graduate, he served in the U.S. Army for 28 years on active duty in command and staff positions in the U.S. and overseas, including Operations Desert Storm and Enduring Freedom, before he retired as a colonel. Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Joe. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, so we are very excited to talk about this book, and I'm just curious, for someone who had a career in the Army, how did you become interested in the Battle of Saratoga, and what connections do you see between this colonial era conflict and today's Army?
Well, it probably goes all the way back to when I was a cadet at West Point. Of course, being right there in the Hudson Valley, all the American Revolution stuff that was around there. I mean, it really got me interested there. And then when I went back to teach at West Point as a young captain, and of course, we taught the American Revolution and we taught the Saratoga campaign. And that got me really interested in it. And I actually was able to visit the whole region up north of Albany. Fell in love with it. It's just such a beautiful area, and it really got me interested. And so when Oxford asked me to do this part of their Pivotal Moments in American History series, I jumped at the chance. And as far as the second part of your question, how does this almost 250-year-old campaign relate to today? Actually, I think there's a lot of very interesting things from this particular campaign that you can bring forward to today. There's leadership lessons, there's lessons about strategy, all sorts of fascinating connections that you can make.
Excellent. And I definitely want to bring in those elements as we talk about the book. So maybe we could just start with you giving us a quick overview of the military situation at the time and the British plans for the year 1777.
Well, the year 1776 ended on a bit of a high note for the Americans. I mean, it looked really bad going through the second part of 1776 when the British kicked Washington and his army out of New York City and Long Island, forced Washington to retreat back across New Jersey. The army was melting away. And at the very end of 1776, Washington stops the bleeding with the famous crossing of the Delaware and the Battle of Trenton, and then he followed that up with the Battle of Princeton shortly thereafter. So in terms of military significance, fairly small battles, but they were huge strategically because they sort of stopped the bleeding, they reinvigorated the American war effort, and it showed to the British Commander-in-Chief, General Sir William Howe, that this wasn't going to be a sort of a piece of cake that I think he thought it was going to be to subdue the American Revolution. So the British start looking to come up with a strategy for 1777, which they really wanted it to be the war-winning strategy. They wanted to put this war to bed, finish it off, finish the American Revolution off so they could go on to other things. So they basically had two competing plans that were presented to them, the decision makers in London, and we're mainly talking about, of course, King George III, who was involved in this, and also his Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord George Germain. And he was really the man responsible for managing the war in America. So these two competing plans were presented. One was by Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. And what Burgoyne offers as a plan is a complex, imaginative plan that calls for three converging columns, one coming up the Hudson River, another one coming down the Mohawk River, and another one coming south along the Lake Champlain Hudson River corridor, all meeting at Albany. And the idea was to split the more rebellious northern colonies from what they thought were the less rebellious southern colonies and middle colonies, split them up, split the Americans apart, and then they could subdue them then. And they thought that that would lead to the end of the revolution. General Howe, who's, again, the commander-in-chief, who's in New York, he comes up with his own plan. And his plan is basically, okay, what I want to do is I want to take my big army sitting here in New York City, and I want to take Philadelphia, which is, of course, the seat of the American Congress. And that will force Washington to come out and defend the city. And then I can have my big decisive victory against Washington, which will end the revolution. So by this time, Howe has recognized Washington and his army as the center of gravity of the American Revolution. So you have these two competing plans. And again, the king is involved as well. They have to basically reconcile these plans. And so what happens, instead of coordinating and reconciling these two plans and having one coherent strategy, they end up having two uncoordinated, unsynced strategies. They basically allow Howe to do what he wants to do, with the proviso that once he finishes up his Philadelphia campaign, he would go and support Burgoyne. And then they also authorized Burgoyne to take his army from Canada and head south toward Albany with a supporting force coming down the Mohawk River. So that's what the British end up doing for their strategy for 1777.
Well, that certainly could be a recipe for disaster, having two competing strategic plans, never mind the communications delays. We're talking about weeks within the United States and months in the case of overseas.
You make a fantastic point, because one of the big problems with trying to coordinate this strategy and coming up with a coherent strategy for 1777 is these decision makers were split. Three of these key people were in London, and that was Burgoyne, Germain, and the King. And then the other key decision maker is sitting in New York City, 3,000 miles away. Today, it wouldn't be a problem, of course, but back then, as you said, it would take months to have an exchange of messages going from London to America and then back again. And of course, in America also, the messages only traveled as fast as a person could ride a horse. So trying to coordinate that strategy was very difficult. And of course, what they should have done is they should have picked a good person, put them in America, and give them basic guidance and let them do their thing. But they didn't. They instead tried to micromanage the strategy. And as I think we all know, even the best tactics will have a really hard time fixing a bad strategy. And really, just about everything that will happen in the Saratoga campaign will be born out of this weak strategic foundation that they developed for 1777.
Right. And then we see on the American side, there's challenges there. We have Washington as commander-in-chief. He has his strategic goals. It could be a little different up in the Northern Department. Add to that, you've got some questions about unity of command involving Gates and Schuyler. So could you discuss some of the issues involved with that for our listeners?
Washington, early in the war, pursued a strategy that we would call a strategy of post. Hold on to key positions and basically dare the British to come and get them. So this worked at the Battle of Bunker Hill, at least to an extent, when the British threw troops against American fortified positions and took horrific casualties. And then the Americans tried that again in Long Island and Manhattan. And by that time, the British have learned their lesson, and they're not about to throw troops against fortified positions. And so they maneuver Washington out of those positions and force him out. And so as his army is melting away, as he's retreating across New Jersey, Washington gradually will adopt a new strategy, a Fabian strategy, which is to hold on to your army, preserve your army at almost all costs, and only strike when you have an advantage. So it's basically a strategy of attrition or exhaustion. So that's the main strategy he's going to pursue for his main army. And then for the Northern Department, of course, any invasion that the British conduct from Canada, he wants to stop. So the Northern Army's job is to basically guard the American northern flank. As you mentioned, there's a unity of command issue for the Northern Department. Major General Philip Schuyler is commanding the Northern Department. He leaves the department to go to Philadelphia to try to defend his reputation, which had been tarnished a bit by some rumors and some criticism within Congress. So he basically leaves his command. And about that same time, Congress has ordered Major General Horatio Gates to take charge of Fort Ticonderoga. Well, when Gates shows up in the Northern Department, there's been a vacuum because Schuyler has left, and Gates basically takes it upon himself to take command of the entire department and not just Fort Ticonderoga. And so what happens is no one's really sure who's overall in charge of the Northern Department, and so things inevitably will fall through the cracks. And one of the things that falls through the cracks is the defense of Fort Ticonderoga. Gates will supply some advice to the senior officers up there, but he never goes up to Fort Ticonderoga in the spring of 1777 to check it out for himself, even though, technically speaking, he was supposed to be commanding up at Ticonderoga. So it leads to some problems, and what's going to end up happening is Ticonderoga is in no shape to defend themselves against Burgoyne's invasion when he comes down from Canada. When I say that, I mean they're not in the best of positions. I actually think they could have defended for quite some time up there had they had an overall Northern Department commander who was paying attention. But again, you have this sort of split command, and it's not until early June that Congress basically resolves that command issue and puts Schuyler back up there in command, and Gates leaves.
Well, as you say, Northern Department, they're trying to figure out who's really in charge up there. But, the enemy's can be coming. And speaking
That's
of
right.
Fort Ticonderoga, in terms of not being prepared in time, I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the engineering issues that were involved that led to what many would say, premature loss of the fort.
That's one of the interesting things. The engineer in charge at Ticonderoga wasn't really an engineer. I mean, he was a patriot. He gave his whole life to the revolution, starting at the first battles around Boston. But he really didn't know what he was doing. And so they wasted all sorts of time and effort putting fortifications where they really weren't doing any good. They weren't sighted into the terrain very well, and just a lot of sort of spinning their wheels when they could have been doing some other things. And one thing that Gates does is he sends a young Polish engineer, Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko, up to Ticonderoga. And Kosciuszko does a tour of the fortifications and basically says, okay, you guys are not doing this right. We need to be doing this, that, and the other thing. And Kosciuszko's advice is, for the most part, ignored. One of the things that Gates advised the commanders up at Ticonderoga to do was to fortify Mount Defiance, which gives the most beautiful view of the entire area. It's the tallest hill in the area, and it dominates both Fort Ticonderoga, the old French stone fort, and it also dominates Mount Independence, which is the high ground on the other side of the lake, just across from Fort Ticonderoga. So the Americans do nothing to fortify that hill. I mean, if they had put a company of soldiers up there, that probably would have been enough. But they don't do anything. And so ultimately, when Burgoyne heads south to Fort Ticonderoga, the British very quickly find that nobody's up on Mount Defiance, and they're able to drag some guns up there. And in part, that's going to help convince the Americans to evacuate the fort.
Certainly, ceding the high ground and allowing the enemy to get artillery up there, it's not surprising that they found themselves in an untenable position. So at that point, Fort Ticonderoga was lost, the Americans withdrawing down the Hudson Valley. But Burgoyne doesn't really follow up on it. He kind of takes his time, and you talk about in the book how a lot of the struggles that he faces can be attributed to logistics. Can you talk about that and how the need for provisions ultimately led to the Battle of Bennington?
So when he leaves Canada and heads south, he leaves with full knowledge that he doesn't have everything. He's taking a calculated risk. And in his mind, he thinks that he's really not going to have a problem getting down to Albany. I mean, he never really thinks that he's going to have any problem at all. I mean, he's not very impressed with the American soldiers. He's not very impressed with Americans writ large. And he doesn't think it's going to be a problem. He thinks that he's going to have a huge amount of loyalist support in the area and that he'll be able to get provisions from those folks. He not only is going to be short actual provisions, he's also short transport. So he's short oxen and carts and horses and things like that. And if anything, that actually might be the most significant shortage that he has. So when he takes Ticonderoga very, very quickly, which surprises him, he thinks that Ticonderoga will probably be the hardest part of his entire campaign. So he seizes it very, very quickly. And I think, number one, he gets overconfident. He really thinks now that he's not going to have any problem getting to Albany. And so I think he's thinking, I don't need to hurry. Now, because he doesn't have all the transport he needs, he decides to march the army overland. And then for all of his artillery and things like that, all the heavy things, they'll go by water down Lake George, where the road network's a little bit better once you get to the southern tip. And so all this takes time, splitting the army. This part will be marching, this part will be going by water, and all that takes time. So by the time he's ready to move, he's given General Schuyler, the American, who's had a chance now to kind of reconstitute the shattered army after the loss of Ticonderoga. He's able to pull together the army a little bit better. And because the road network that Burgoyne has to march on is very poor, he's able to obstruct that road network. And he's also able to harass Burgoyne as he's heading south. So you've got a logistics problem, you've got a transport problem, which is all part of logistics, of course. And then you've also got the Americans have recovered somewhat, and they're showing some resistance as you're trying to head south. I mean, his route of march all the way down to the battlefields at Saratoga ends up being about a mile a day when you figure it all out. It's awfully tough to win a campaign at that march rate.
They are moving incredibly slowly, and that allows time for militia to come in, right?
Yeah. although the bulk of the militia isn't really going to come in until a little bit later on, mainly after Bennington. But you're right. That does give them some time to go out and try to get those militia folks. So he's heading south. He's moving very slowly. And of course, since he's moving so slowly, he's using up more provisions. By the time he gets to Fort Miller, which is in the first couple weeks in August, now his logistics issues are acute. He's learned through his intelligence that there's cattle and also transport, available wagons and carts and things like that, in the vicinity of Bennington, Vermont. And so what he decides to do is send out a raiding party, a raid, of a little over 1,000 men to go seize this cattle and then bring it back to the main army. And that way they're going to have plenty of provisions to make it all the way to Albany. So he sends those guys out. They're mostly German troops. Not only does he have British regulars, he also has a very large contingent of German mercenary troops, some Canadian troops, and he's got a large contingent of American Indians. So he sends this German force out. They head out there and they run into an American militia force commanded by General John Stark, who is famous, of course, for coining the phrase "live free or die" as the motto of New Hampshire. So John Stark and his mostly New Hampshire militia will basically destroy that foraging party, that raiding party. And this is a huge blow for Burgoyne because he loses well over 10% of his force. Not only that, but he gets none of the provisions that he needed. And because his Native Americans see what happened at this disaster at Bennington, his Native Americans basically desert him. Very few will remain with him to the bitter end. And the Native Americans were really important because he used them for reconnaissance, for screening his army from the prying eyes of the Americans, for obviously raiding and things like that. So it's an absolute brutal disaster, Bennington, but yet Burgoyne decides to press on instead of cutting his losses and heading back to Ticonderoga, which he should have done at that point.
Well, you raise an interesting question about the ongoing challenge of working with allies. But we have Burgoyne getting back, deciding to proceed to Albany. At this point, setting up for the final battles of Saratoga and Victory. So tell us about, first of all, the change with Gates coming in, and then how did Gates actually secure the victory?
Ticonderoga falls on the 6th of July. And throughout the month of July, Schuyler is actually doing a pretty good job with the Northern Army, again, kind of rebuilding it and also doing a fairly good job trying to obstruct and slow down Burgoyne as he's heading south. But his messages back to Congress and Washington, his commander-in-chief, are just a constant drumbeat of pessimism. In fact, not only just pessimism, but in some cases, downright panic. And so Washington is trying to buck him up. He's trying to give him advice and support. He sends Schuyler reinforcements. And probably most importantly, he sends Schuyler some really key leaders. Among those leaders are probably his most aggressive combat commander, Major General Benedict Arnold. He sends one of his commanders who's really, really good with militia, which Schuyler is not. So he sends him Major General Benjamin Lincoln. And he also sends him extra units to include probably his most elite unit, the Delta Force of its day, which is Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. So Washington is trying to support him as best he can, but he's getting all these negative messages and woe is me, and there's no way I'm going to be able to stop Burgoyne and blah, blah. Finally, Congress has just had enough of it, and they relieve him at the end of July, early August, and they decide to replace him with Horatio Gates.
How did Gates secure the final victory?
So after Gates takes command, he starts moving the army north. They find a really good defensive position called Bemis Heights, just north of Stillwater, New York, that commanded the Hudson River and the road to Albany, and there Gates dug in the army. As the British will cross over to the west bank of the Hudson River and head south, and when they get within striking distance, Burgoyne decides that he wants to try to get around Gates's left flank. So he attacks on the 19th of September at a battle that will be called the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Gates manages the battle pretty well. He keeps the vast bulk of his troops behind their fortifications on Bemis Heights. He sends out forces piecemeal, starting with Morgan's riflemen, and they're able to stop the British advance at Freeman's Farm. So the Freeman's Farm battle ends with actually some of the most bitter fighting of the war, but it ends with the British holding on to the battlefield at Freeman's Farm, but they take twice the amount of casualties. And of course, they can't afford those kind of casualties. Burgoyne decides to dig in, He's hoping that the British will send a relief column up the Hudson River to basically rescue him, or at least to draw Gates off of him so he can continue on to Albany. There is a rescue attempt that's sent from New York City under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Henry Clinton, but they only get as far as present-day Kingston, New York, which is still 70 miles away, so they're not able to save Burgoyne. But by this time, Burgoyne's food and fodder for his animals are at horrible levels. His troops are hungry, his animals are hungry. He decides to send out a reconnaissance force to try to find some food and also maybe figure out a way that they can slip by Gates. They do that on the 7th of October, but once again, Gates is able to manage the battle, send out forces just like he did at Freeman's Farm, this time with Benedict Arnold leading the way. Arnold is able to spot a weakness in the German fortifications. He attacks. He's severely wounded, but the Americans outflank Burgoyne, and Burgoyne is forced to order a retreat north. The exhausted army will retreat north with Gates following slowly behind, and they finally grind to a halt at a place called Saratoga, present-day Schuylerville, New York. And after some negotiations, they agree to surrender terms. And Burgoyne will surrender on the 17th of October, 1777.
A major victory for the Americans, removing one of two main armies on the British side, tremendous implications to come. And the book obviously goes through a lot of great detail, talking about the problems that Burgoyne and others had with the strategic planning. But to wrap up, I just wanted you to kind of touch on the idea of leadership and the contributions that leadership made into the final outcome.
I think it was significant. If you look at the leadership of both sides, I would say that from Colonel on down, leadership is excellent on both sides. Both sides could really boast some superb leaders. And there's really good leaders on both sides in the general officer rank. Simon Fraser is a superstar on the British side. But when you give it sort of a holistic look, I think the American senior leaders did a better job. And I particularly point to Washington as commander-in-chief versus Howe as commander-in-chief. Washington not only is commanding his own army down there in New Jersey and having to face Howe during the Philadelphia campaign, he's acting as a true commander-in-chief and looking at the entire war effort. And he's trying to direct the entire war effort and all the things that fall into that. Howe, instead, he's focused on fighting his army to the exclusion of almost everything else, even though he's the commander-in-chief on the British side. And so when Burgoyne heads south and he moves into New York State, he falls under Howe, but Howe basically ignores him. And so that's just one piece of it. The American senior officers in particular just made better decisions with the information that they had. And of course, nobody ever has perfect information, but they just do a better job. And that and strategy will tell when this campaign is all said and done.
It's a remarkable story. It's remarkable the decisions that they were able to make given the state of communications back in the 18th century. It's a fascinating story, and I'm glad you were here to share that with our guests.
Oh, I really enjoyed it, Joe. Thank you.
And I want to thank Kevin Weddle for being our guest on the podcast. The book is The Compleat Victory, Saratoga, and the American Revolution. Thanks again, Kevin.
To all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Army Matters podcast on iTunes and everywhere podcasts are found. The Army Matters podcast series is brought to you by the Association of the United States Army, the U.S. Army's professional association, member-supported, Army-connected. Visit us at AUSA.org for more information or to become a member. Your membership helps AUSA continue to carry out its mission to educate, inform, and connect with the total Army, our industry partners, and our supporters of a strong national defense. For questions or to provide topic recommendations, email us at podcast@ausa.org. Have a great Army Day. Hua.